Hello, everyone, and welcome to another educational session from New Brain Nutrition and Eat to Be Nice. Today, we're talking with Dr. Daan van Rooij. He's going to be talking on neuroimaging of impulsivity and compulsivity and the influence of nutrition on the brain. And here's a picture of both of us. On the left, you'll see Daan van Rooij. He's at the Donders Center for Cognitive Neuroimaging and Institut for Brain Cognition and Behavior at Radboud University, and that's in the Netherlands. And my name is Jonathan Marks. I'm the Media and Marketing Director for New Brain Nutrition and Eat to Be Nice. And with that, I'll let Dan take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Yeah, so today we'll be talking about impulsivity and compulsivity and neuroimaging. I myself am in the field of neuroimaging and neurodevelopmental disorders. So that means that I'll also be taking a look at this topic mainly from the viewpoint of neurodevelopmental disorders. I'll start with a short slide showing what I want to talk about today. So mainly there'll be two parts to this webinar. The first part being mainly about the neuroimaging of impulsivity and compulsivity. There's three main things I'd like to talk about here. The first thing I think is important is why do we study the brain in neurodevelopmental disorders and how? Then I'd like to go into a bit about why we use then impulsivity and compulsivity as relevant features in this study. And I'd like to show you a little bit about the kind of brain mechanisms that we are studying in this field. And then in the second part, we'll introduce lifestyle and nutrition and its relation to the brain. There I'll be talking first about what we know about the links between lifestyle, nutrition, and the brain and behavior. And then I'll try to see how that is relevant for neurodevelopmental disorders and also for the studying of impulsivity and compulsivity, which we talked about in part 1. And then all the way at the end, I'll talk about our current research. And there I'll bring it all together and I'll talk about how that all links together from the brain mechanisms in neurodevelopmental disorders and the influence of lifestyle and nutrition on them.
Great. Dan, let me ask a question, especially about part 2, the influence of lifestyle and nutrition on the brain. Is that marginally effective and important for people who don't have disorders?
Yes, and that's something that will keep coming back here. And this is also one of the main reasons that I think studying impulsivity and compulsivity and other such features in a continuous measure is important, because we would like to translate these things also to, well, everybody really. So I think that's one of the things we'll keep coming back at different points about how this is not just relevant for the neurodevelopmental disorders, though we are mainly studying the different factors in those groups at the moment.
Right. Thank you.
So first, let's talk a little bit about neurodevelopmental disorders. So neurodevelopmental disorders are the types of disorders that manifest very early in development. So think of disorders like ADHD or autism, which are often diagnosed somewhere between the second and the 6th year of life. These disorders, they influence the brain development at a very basic level. And if they are not properly diagnosed and properly treated, they'll also continue causing lifelong problems for the different kinds of patients. And also on all kinds of different fields. So think of, for instance, academic or work life, but also on a social level or on the family level. So this is why we think it is important to study the brain in these kinds of disorders. It is necessary to understand better the biological mechanisms behind them so we can detect and treat them better in the future. But also we want to do things like study the brain to be able to predict the trajectory of these disorders. We want to know which patients will likely remit from a disorder and which one will keep seeing problems throughout their life. And lastly, and related to this, neurodevelopmental disorders are notoriously difficult to treat. So some people respond well to medication or behavioral therapy for ADHD or for autism, but others don't. And looking at the brain, we also would like to be able to predict which individuals would respond well to which kind of treatments. And this is also very relevant when we look at interventions into lifestyle or nutrition, which are also very specific to the individual. So this is why we study these disorders. Classically, if we look at the major neurodevelopmental disorders, we can make a picture like this. So here I've done a very coarse visual representation of 4 of the main neurodevelopmental disorders. We have ADHD there, we have ASD or autism, we have Tourette's disorders, and we have OCD or obsessive compulsive disorders. And classically, they were defined lists of symptoms, so to say. If you have enough symptoms, you have the disorder. If you don't have enough symptoms, you don't. But what we see in the practice is that it's a little more complicated than that. We see that a lot of subjects that come in share traits between different disorders. So they might have some symptoms of other disorders, or they might even have multiple of these disorders at the same time. And that's what I'm trying to indicate by the overlapping fields here. As well, we see that there's an overlapping genetic risks. And the way we see that is that if there's a family where one of these disorders is prevalent, there's also a higher chance that you'll see the other ones popping up. And lastly, it becomes complex because there's a lot of heterogeneity in the disorders. So not all of the patients that come in with one of the disorders have the same types of symptoms, but there's also a lot of difference between them.
There are a lot of challenges in treating this, in order to understand what's going on.
Yes, they're very complex disorders, and that's also why the treatment is so difficult. And this is also what brings us to the point of impulsivity and compulsivity. Because we think one of the ways we can look at this differently, or can look at this in a better way, is to not look at this as categorically different things, these different disorders, or qualitatively different things, but more to look at these as different representations of some underlying cognitive features, like impulsivity and compulsivity, which can be seen on a spectrum. So here I've taken the same picture again of those 4 disorders, but this time I've put them on a spectrum from more impulsive to more compulsive. And what we think that it's good to study this, because this means that we can compare similar types of underlying cognitive features in the same kind of disorders. So for instance, in ADHD, you have a lot of impulsive behavior, but also in disorders like Tourette's, you have also very impulsive actions. In disorders like conduct disorder, you have very impulsive aggression, and in things like addiction, you have very impulsive behaviors. So that means we can use impulsivity to look at similar factors between different disorders. The same way in compulsivity, you'll see that, of course, you'll have things like compulsive behavior, like compulsive hand washing that you see a lot in obsessive compulsive disorders. But also in autism, you'll see types of behavior that are very ritualized and very rigid according to one particular schedule. So this way, we can view these disorders as not distinct entities, but more as different representations on one continuum. And this is also very interesting from a brain perspective, because really both impulsivity and compulsivity are very much related to a lack of conscious control over the actions. So both in impulsive and compulsive behaviors, we do things that we really consciously don't want to do or can't stop ourselves from doing. And this is interesting because in the brain, we know that these are very related mechanisms. So this also may help us understand if there's similar brain mechanisms that might underlie the similar types of behaviors in these different disorders.
It's very interesting that you just said there's no awareness and no control.
Yeah, or you might see it as there is like the awareness that you might want to not do something or stop something, but you're still unable to stop yourself from doing it. And this is the same both for impulsive and compulsive behaviors. And this is something that we can all relate to. So this is also important. This is something that is not unique to neurodevelopmental disorders, but everybody has impulsive and compulsive actions to some degree in their life. So what we can see the whole population as being on some kind of spectrum, from very impulsive to very compulsive. And this means that we're no longer thinking of binary categories, like you have a disorder or you don't, but more in how much impulsive behavior do you have, how much compulsive behavior do you have. So this means that we can use impulsivity and compulsivity as a tool to study overlapping features between disorders, but also that we can use these traits to generalize what we learn about the brain in neurodevelopmental disorders and apply that to the general population. So what you could say is that instead of saying that the brains of a patient population are qualitatively different in some way, instead what you might think of is that there is a continuum in the population. So say that this is a graph of the amount of impulsive features you have, then most of the people will have an average amount of impulsivity features, Some of them will have very few, and some of them will have very much. Now we can then draw a line saying this is the diagnostic criterion, and everybody that has more features than that line is a clinical group. But if we want to study the brain, it's actually really much more informative to just take a very broad population and seeing if we can put them on a scale from very few impulsivity symptoms to very many, and see how that relates to changes in the brain as you go along that scale.
Fascinating. So you really are testing a wide variety of people.
Yes, so this brings you away from the view that you want to study one disorder and compare them to a healthy population, but more that the healthy population on itself contains all kinds of different extremes, which we might classify as disorders, but which on a brain level are just scales on different continuums. And impulsivity and compulsivity are two of the main ones, but of course you can also think of other continuous scales. We'll keep talking about impulsivity and compulsivity for today, because that's already complex enough.
Okay.
So let's continue. Last thing why this might be interesting is that heterogeneity that we see within a patient population. It is also true that not every patient in every disorder has the same kind of symptoms. And by taking these kind of continuous measures like impulsivity, compulsivity, you can also see if you can find certain subgroups within the population, and seeing if they also are more the same on a brain level. So this is a example, this little figure that you see here with the different color dots. You could say this might represent a group of people with ADHD, and that some of those people have a lot of impulsivity, but no compulsivity. Some of them have impulsive and compulsive features, and some of them have neither. So you can really make three groups which are more similar to each other, which might help you explain differences in the brain which we see within the whole group of people with ADHD. So that's an example how we can use these continuous measures not only to see the similarities between disorders, but also to see if there are specific subgroups within a disorder. Hope that's a bit clear.
Yes, very.
All right. So what about the brain? We've been talking a lot about different neurodevelopmental disorders. We were talking about a lot of impulsivity and compulsivity. But what we mainly study here is the brain. And what we know from a lot of studies that have been done in the general population is that there are certain neural circuits, so certain collections of brain regions, which cause both excessive impulsive and compulsive behaviors. Together we reference them as the cortical striatal loops. So these are loops between the cortex and the striatum, deeper lying regions, and they govern the control over our behavior. Now, these three different pictures show three different cortical striatal loops that are related to different types of behavior. But the main thing to take away is that the middle one is the one we're talking about, and that governs the control that we have over our impulsive and compulsive actions. I'll show you some examples of the type of work that we've been doing looking at these cortical striatal loops in the different neurodevelopmental disorders, and how looking at impulsivity and compulsivity can help us understand the underlying mechanisms here.
And so, Dan, all the different parts here in these circuits, this is all within the brain? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, so these are all different brain areas which are all interconnected with each other, and they have to work together very well for you to have a good balance between not too much impulsive and not too much compulsive behavior. So they want you to do certain things, but they don't want you to do too rash things. So there needs to be a little bit of impulsivity, but there also needs to be a little bit of top-down control. So you need to have a little bit of both to function well in daily life. And so that means that if things go wrong in these kind of circuits, so if any one of these regions doesn't function properly, or if one of the connections between them doesn't function properly, you can get problems with your behavior. And that can go in different ways. So some alterations might cause more impulsive behaviors, and some alterations might cause more compulsive behaviors. But this means that with this system, you have a very nice mechanism which we can study across different disorders and the population, which might help explain why we see similar types of behavior in different kinds of patient groups.
Thank you.
So the first example I want to show you is this study. It's a study that's been published in 2017 by Dr. Naaje. And she took a look at both children with autism and children with obsessive compulsive disorder. And she took a look at one of the main nodes in the cortical striatal network, namely the ACC. And what she wanted to know is whether the amount of a certain brain chemical, glutamate, in that region would differ between these groups. And what she found is it really doesn't. Both children with ADHD and OCD showed the same levels of glutamate. But what she did find is that if you take a look at compulsivity, the amount of glutamate in the ACC very strongly predicted the amount of compulsive features that these subjects showed. So this is a very nice example because it shows how taking a look at something like compulsivity can show you an underlying shared mechanism between two different disorders, which works on the same brain region and the same neurochemical, which we didn't know about before. So this helps us understand how these different disorders can still show similar, types of behavior, even though the specific symptoms for OCD and ASD may be very different.
And did I understand that you said she found that if there was more glutamate, she also found more OCD behavior?
More compulsive behavior, yes.
Oh, compulsive, okay.
So the type of compulsive behavior looks different in autism and OCD, but even though the specific expression of that compulsivity is slightly different between disorders, the underlying mechanism is still the same. However, it can also work the other way around. So I have another example here. It's a study by Maria Paraskevopoulou. It's still in development here, who was studying a group of children with ADHD. She was also looking at these cortical striatal loops, and she was focusing on the activity that we found in the striatum, so deep in the cores of the brain. And she saw that there's a different amount of activation during one of the tasks that the children were doing between the subjects with ADHD that just had regular ADHD, as compared to a group of subjects which had ADHD but also showed a lot of substance use problems. So these were adolescents, so they were smoking a lot, drinking a lot, and she saw that that kind of behavior gave a difference in the brain signal. So she went also on to investigate impulsivity in these groups, and what she showed mainly was that the relation between the brain activation in the striatum and impulsivity was very different from the subjects with ADHD versus the subjects that had ADHD and also substance use problems. So this shows that looking at impulsivity allowed us to see a subgroup within the ADHD population, which we didn't know about before, and specifically one that we could predict using these impulsivity scores. So using impulsivity and compulsivity can help us not only see the common underlying mechanisms, like in the last example, but also can show us the differences between different groups within a certain disorder. Does that make sense?
Yes. And can you explain the lines? I see the bottom line, and I'm talking about the graph on the right. The bottom line, I believe, is the control group.
And so there are three lines shown there. There's the line that goes steeply up, the dashed line, and that is the group that has ADHD plus also substance use problems. Then there's the bottom line, the dash dot line, that's the regular controls. And then there's another dotted line in the middle, which are the subjects with just ADHD. So we can see that if you just look at the direction of the lines, the subjects with ADHD and the healthy controls both show a relatively flat line. But the other group, the subjects with ADHD and substance use problems, they show a really strong correlation between the amount of brain activation and the impulsive behavior that they're showing, which is of course also related to that substance use behavior that they're showing in real life. So it shows how these three levels of interpretation, the brain level, the impulsivity level, and the behavior level, all interplay in these subject groups.
Very interesting.
So the conclusions I want to draw very much in general are that using these categorical features like impulsivity, like compulsivity, they are very useful for investigating the differences and the similarities between the different neurodevelopmental disorders. And I think what is important is that neuroimaging studies like the ones we are doing should aim at integrating multiple disorders so that we can develop one or multiple overarching frameworks that explain these disorders and also allow us to generalize to these kind of systems in the general population.
Let me ask a question just for my information, and I think there might be audience interest as well. Is neuroimaging practical at this point in clinical settings, or is it really only used for research at this point?
Now, neuroimaging, as we do it, so in an MRI scanner, is really only useful for academic setting at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
What we see is that if you want something to be clinically relevant to predict whether somebody has a diagnosis, whether someone will remit or persist from a disorder, or whether someone will respond to a treatment, you really want to have one very reliable measure which will tell you with a certain percentage how much chance somebody has to have a disorder or remit or persist. And that we don't have yet. What we see in the brain is that we can find differences in individuals, but we see them in all kinds of different metrics. And some patients have some brain alterations and some of them are other ones. So we have a lot of little changes in the brain on a group level, but on an individual level, it remains really hard to predict which brain features we should focus at. So there's not one very accurate marker yet. And that's what you would want to have if you want to do this in the clinic. And that's what we are continuing to look for. And what we think might be a way forward is that we have to stop looking at very specific markers in the brain. Like we can't say if somebody has ADHD or not by just looking at the volume of some brain regions. What we think we might need to do is to integrate a lot of information from all kinds of different brain measures to be able to allow to do that, to accurately predict these kind of things. But the problem there is, clinically, that's very hard to do because you don't want to make a lot of scans for every single subject before you can predict whether they have ADHD or not. That's just not clinically feasible yet. So there needs to be, well, there's a lot of work still done in this field, but this is why I think it's important to keep working on examining these basic mechanisms in the brain. We need to understand those first before we can go to one marker that explains all of the disorder.
Thank you, Dan, for that. I appreciate the explanation.
All right, then we'll go on to the second part of the lecture, the influence of lifestyle and nutrition on the brain. So what's the relevance here for the neurodevelopmental disorders we've been talking about? Well, mainly there is a very high demand from the clinical practice for alternative or additional treatments next to the general medication and behavioral therapy that are usually available. This is because not all the medication and therapy works for all the patients, or you might have some side effects. So there's a lot of room still left for improvement for treatment of these basic disorders. And lifestyle factors and nutrition might very well fit this role. And it might not necessarily be to cure a disorder. So we don't think we can cure ADHD, for instance, by changing the diet, but it's more to change the symptoms or lessen the symptoms in such a way that alleviate the disease burden a lot. And that's what has been very promising in these kind of studies, looking at lifestyle and nutrition on the brain. And it will also be likely that things like a nutritional intervention or lifestyle intervention are not very specific to only one disorder. Instead, they might work on categorical features like impulsivity or compulsivity that are shared between a lot of different disorders. And this is also very important because this might be generalizable to the whole population. So if we can learn about what the influence of diet and exercise are on the brain in these patient groups, this might also be relevant for everybody in the end. So this is why we want to study this further. And I'll talk a little bit about what we already know on this regard. So I'll give you some examples of the links that we already are familiar with between lifestyle or nutrition interventions and brain or behavior. And the first one I want to mention is the link between exercise and depression. This is one of the most well-studied and oldest links between lifestyle and the brain that we know. And there have been many studies in the last couple of years that have looked at interventions of exercise on the treatment for depression. They can be summarized very nicely by this graph. This is a publication from 2016, which listed here all the studies that have been done that looked at the influence of exercise on depressed patients. And all of the little blocks that are right from the center indicate that there was a positive effect. So they found that more exercise helps alleviate depressive symptoms. So overall, these studies found that there's a huge benefit for patients that are depressed if they start exercising more. And so the good thing about this is that this is not instead of the regular treatment. They can do this next to the medication that they're receiving or the therapy that they're receiving. And the second example I want to show is about the link between diet and ADHD. This is also something that's investigated already a couple of years ago. And what we see here is a publication from 2016. There's a lot of bar graphs here. But what we show is that there's two groups of patients here. One group of patients, the red ones, which had no treatment, and the blue patients, which went on a very strict diet, the elimination diet, they called it. And every column here is a different measure for ADHD at the start of the intervention, so those are the bars on the left, and at the end, so those are all the bars on the right. So what we see here that in all kinds of metrics for ADHD, so the overall symptoms, but also the impulsivity or the inattentiveness, they all go down for the subjects that follow this diet. So that's very compelling evidence that different lifestyle or nutrition interventions can change the behavior in depression and ADHD. And we know that these kind of behaviors must be mediated through change in the brain. What we don't know yet is how that works. So if you guys seen the rest of the lectures in this series, in lecture 1, there was a whole lecture only on the gut-brain axis.
Correct.
This might be one of the main ways in which diet can influence the behavior via the gut-brain axis. But how that looks like in the brain is still very much unknown. And that's one of the major things that we're trying to find out now, is if we can have these lifestyle and nutrition interventions in different patient groups, and we know about their microbiome, then we can also make scans of their brain, scans of the function of their brain, scans of the structure of their brain, seeing how the changes in the diet, in the microbiome, and in the brain lead to these changes in the behavior.
Dan, just a question on the previous slide. Do we know enough about the elimination diet that we can tell people what foods might be eliminated from their diet or what kinds of foods? Are we at the clinical level yet, or is this just initial research?
This is one of the first studies into that elimination diet. One of the studies that we're now running as part of the New Brain Nutrition Project is a follow-up on that. And there we are specifically looking at comparing the elimination diet to a regular, very healthy diet. So what we're trying to find out here is this effect due to the subject just eating healthy, or is it specifically this very strict elimination diet that was doing the trick for ADHD? Now, the elimination diet is very special because subjects can only eat very few food types for a period of time. And if they respond well to that, if the ADHD symptoms they are experiencing decrease, then they can slowly start to reintroduce food groups. And with each food group, they have to check if the ADHD symptoms come back or not. Now, this means that you can end up with a very unique individual diet for everybody, which works for them. So that's a lot of time and effort. But of course, we need to know if this is necessary or if it's just the effect of a healthy diet in general that's leading to benefits for people with ADHD.
Got it. So that's the research that we're doing in the Eat to Be Nice project, which is, I guess, comparing a healthy diet against an elimination diet and really see which one's more effective and how they affect symptoms.
Exactly. And that's also one of the studies that we are incorporating in our brain imaging studies. We're also looking at the effects of these different diets in the brain. And if we can see an effect of one of these diets or both of them, then we can also compare, do they affect the same underlying brain mechanisms or do they work via different ways? And this is very interesting. So we can really compare what happens on the brain level with these different types of interventions.
Great. This is a lot of exciting news coming up, folks. So stay with us on New Brain Nutrition. We'll keep you very informed.
All right. So I'll go to my last example of the relation between lifestyle, nutrition, and the brain. This is an example of how a large-scale study in the general population has shown that there is a very strong link between the way the brain is organized and lifestyle and nutritional factors in the general population. That is this study from 2015. They took a very interesting approach. They had a lot of subjects, about 460 subjects. They had brain imaging from these subjects, looking at the connectivity of the brain. So they looked at how the brain was organized in a very basic way. But then they took a lot of other measures as well. 280 different behavioral and demographic measures they had for all these subjects. So they had things like what kind of diet they followed, what kind of intelligence score they had, what kind of education they did, how many psychiatric problems they had. And then they tried to combine these two data sets. So they tried to see if there was a correlation between certain lifestyle and demographic factors and the very basic organization of brain activation. And what they found was that there was one major component of functional connectivity, which was associated with a very prominent positive-negative axis containing a lot of the lifestyle and nutrition factors. So what that means is if you look at this list here, these are all the factors that are correlated in a positive or negative way with the organization of the connectivity in the brain. And what you can see is that all these things are associated with each other. So in the positive list, there are a lot of things like intelligence tests, but there's also things like financial income, life satisfaction. There's things like years since you smoked your last cigarette in there. So there's also a lot of lifestyle factors that positively associate with the organization of the brain. While in the negative list, so at the bottom half of the list here, there's also a lot of things which go together. Things like alcohol problems, tobacco use, THC use, but also sleep quality or aggressive and angry behavior, rule-breaking behavior. So there seems to be a general structure of positive and negative lifestyle factors and behaviors, which is very highly correlated with the very basic organization of the brain. So this shows that on a very fundamental level, we can link how the brain is organized to these kinds of factors in the general population as well, which is another reason why looking at this the way we are is so interesting for not just the patient groups, but also everybody else here.
I want to make a distinction, Dan, and you can correct me or confirm what I'm saying, but this study shows correlations, which means that things existed together. It doesn't mean that one causes the other, correct?
Yeah, that's true. So these are all kinds of factors which were measured at a single time point, and it's impossible to dissociate which factors causes which. Right. So it's for instance not clear if having a better lifestyle causes your different brain organization, or whether a different organization of your brain connectivity causes different lifestyle decisions or a higher EQ or any of those things. Right. The only thing this shows is that at a very basic level, a lot of the positive and negative factors that we know are relevant from our lifestyle interventions and from our healthcare interventions go together, and they're all in the same way correlated with the brain. So it seems that there is a very basic connection between the two, but we are definitely not sure what causes what and exactly how that happens. And that is one of the major points that we're, of course, still trying to figure out.
Right. So the example I was thinking of was down at the bottom with drug and tobacco and THC. It may be, we don't know. All we know is that I guess if there are more symptoms, that there tend to be more drug or alcohol problems or THC or tobacco use, but we don't know if those substances caused the symptoms or whether these behaviors go along with having the symptoms.
Yeah, and that's one of the important things that we need to be very careful about in this kind of brain imaging studies. And this is also why it's important to, not be too hasty with this. One of the main things we need to do is to start following at-risk populations very early in life, before they exhibit any of these behaviors, and try if we can track the brain development over time. And that way we can, for instance, see if the changes in the brain come first and then come problematic behaviors, or is it the other way around? And do they start smoking, drinking first? And does that change the brain in some way?
Right.
And that is very important also if you want to look at impulsivity and compulsivity, because we know that things like smoking alter the development of the brain in adolescence. And if we then afterwards see impulsive behavior, we don't know if the impulsivity led to picking up smoking at an earlier age, or whether it was the other way around and smoking at an early age caused them to be more impulsive later on. So this is one of the key points that I'll also make in the next slide, in the ongoing research about the kinds of things that we still have to figure out and that are important not only in light of these neurodevelopmental disorders, but are important for everybody in the population.
Thank you.
Right, and that brings me to the end of this webinar. The current research that we're doing in light of the new brain nutrition and the Eat to Be Nice project, what we think is important is that we've started a couple of randomized control trials. So those are intervention studies where we take a group of patients and we randomize the group before we assign them to a treatment as usual or one of these new interventions. So this way we can very carefully dissociate what the causal factors are here, so of how the intervention is causing differences in behavior and differences in the brain. We are looking at three different things. We're looking at the effect of exercise in ADHD. We're looking at the effect of a broad vitamin supplementation in ADHD. And we're looking at the effects of different dietary interventions for ADHD. And all three of those, you're also going to take scans of the brains before they start the intervention and after the intervention is finished. So we'll see if the changes in the behavior are also matched by changes in the brain, and if we can predict changes in behavior from those brain scans that we took before the intervention started. So these are the kind of questions that we're trying to answer. The first question is, what are the underlying factors behind the effects of lifestyle and nutrition on ADHD? Can we again see those cortical striatal loops, which I talked about and we're showing here again? And do they also then reflect changes in categorical factors like impulsivity? So can we see that this effect of these interventions is also generalizable to the general population or other disorders? The third question is then, which subjects will respond best to these interventions? Because we expect that not everybody will benefit from more exercise or a better diet. And we would like to know if we can see in the brain which of these subjects will respond well to the treatment and which won't. That's also very important to be able to personalize these kind of treatments. And lastly, what are the long-term effects of lifestyle and nutritional interventions on the brain? So we know that on the short term, we often see a benefit of these interventions, but we don't know if the changes in the brain that we might see are also permanent. So if you change your brain function, if you change your brain structure permanently by these kind of interventions, or whether the changes disappear again after time. And this is the last point that I think is very important to follow up on, and also to make sure that we keep following these groups over a long time to answer these very important questions on nutrition, lifestyle, impulsivity, compulsivity, and the brain.
Dan, if I can just add one more thing to what you were saying before, we're also going to be studying the poop of different people in these studies to see how the bacteria change based upon lifestyle or interventions or diet interventions. And in another of our lectures, as Dan mentioned, we talk about the gut-brain axis and the connection between the gut and the brain and how changes can take effect there as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to thank very much Daan van Rooij, PhD. He's from the Donders Center for Cognitive Neuroimaging and Institute for Brain Cognition and Behavior at Radboud University in the Netherlands. This has been Jonathan Marks with Eat to Be Nice and New Brain Nutrition. Dan, thanks so much. This has been a wonderful presentation. It really shows us what research has taken place before our study has started and what kind of research you're going to be doing during the study. Folks, be patient. We're in the process of beginning these trials to learn more, and then we've got to analyze the data and report out. But part of our purpose during this time is to educate you as to what we're looking at, how we're looking at it, and so that it can be helpful for you and even more helpful when we get the results. Dan, you did a great job. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us in this presentation. We'll see you again on another educational session from New Brain Nutrition and Eat to Be Nice. This is Jonathan Marks and Daan van Rooij. Thanks.
Thank you.